Hi everyone, welcome to the second video in my new Orchestrating Textures series. Today I have another melody and chord progression from one of my supporters on Patreon. Thanks Michael for sending this. The word he used to describe the melody was sad, and based on his description of the piece, I thought the word mournful was appropriate. So throughout this video, I'll be trying to orchestrate accompanying textures to this melody that evoke a mournful or sad feeling. As I did in the last video in this series, I'll orchestrate this melody a few different ways, but before getting into that, let's take a look at this melody. So Dorico has this cool function where I can realize these chord symbols into notes, so let's try doing that. I'll create a second instrument, this one a grand staff, and then select the entire passage in the new empty instrument. Then I right-click, chord symbols and diagrams, then generate notes from chord symbols. You have a few options then. I'm going to make sure the bass notes are present, and I'll use the melody staff as a top note guide. That way the notes that Dorico generates won't go above the melody. Obviously, they're allowed to go above the melody in an orchestral texture, but I'm keeping things simple for now. All right, so Dorico generates notes. Let's hear what that sounds like. So I really like this melody, and I could probably spend an entire hour discussing the melodic shape, chords, chord inversions, harmonic form, all of that stuff. But for the sake of time, I want to focus on just a few aspects of the music. The first one, the regularity of chord changes. The chords change every 4 beats with only one exception. There's nothing wrong with this, of course, but when creating accompanimental figures and backgrounds, I should decide whether or not to highlight that rhythmic regularity. Highlighting it should be really easy. I'll just create an accompaniment that emphasizes the downbeats and sticks to a regular repeating rhythm. The piece that instantly came to mind was the Chopin Prelude in E minor from Opus 28. This is one of Chopin's more famous works, and look at the left-hand rhythm, basically constant eighth note chords, with chord changes happening mostly on beat 1 or beat 3. There's something about the relentless eighth note pattern here that sounds tragic to me. Also the fact that the left-hand chords gradually descend by step throughout the first half of this piece. I think most of us would associate mournful or tragic with heaviness, as in heaviness of the heart perhaps, which might translate to having a strong bass register. At least that's how I think I'd interpret that. In this Chopin piece, he waits all the way until here to use a strong bass entrance. And I think by delaying that moment has more impact. Then at the end, we get really low-voiced, heavy chords, although the dynamics are very soft. The whole piece has been pointing towards this moment, at least in terms of the trajectory of the register. Now, this Chopin piece is extremely pianistic, and as I orchestrate this melody today, I don't want to be thinking pianistically. But I think that there are enough potential similarities here that I may find inspiration from Chopin while creating some textures. So I want to look specifically at the chord rhythms, also chord inversions, as well as creating interesting contrapuntal chord voicings. Right now I have root position chords throughout, but I remember from the Chopin that he used a lot of inversions early on. Because the melody starts on D, which is the root of the chord, I think a first inversion D chord below might be more effective. Then, keeping in mind the descending stepwise pattern in the lowest note from the Chopin piece, I think I'll have the C#7 chord be a first inversion chord as well. I make the same change in measures 5 and 6, the first inversion D chord moving to the first inversion C#7 chord. One other thing I've done here, using those Dorico generated chords as a placeholder, I've moved the top note of the chord lower, so it's not occupying the same range as the melody. So just some simple revoicings and inversions. Let's hear the first 8 measures now. So next, I noticed that the melody goes from this D up by step to the E. Yeah, there's an A pickup note in between, but that's almost more of an ornament, and our ears still hear the overall voice leading as being that ascending whole step. With the chord moving from D to E7, I thought it would be more interesting to have a third inversion E7 chord, so the D remains in the bass from the previous chord. I like the bit of tension this creates, and it also eliminates the parallel octaves. Parallel octaves, of course, are fine in certain places, but here they created a really strong overall feeling of ascension, which I didn't particularly want. Remember, the Chopin had an overall sense of descending over time, so I'm trying to recreate that feel instead. Just a reminder, all of the decisions I'm making are just choices based on my goals for the texture, and with different goals or textures in mind, you might make very different decisions. So notice that in the last 6 measures, I'm lowering the register and adding more voices to the chord, making it heavier overall. Let's hear the last 8 measures now. Now that I'm fairly happy with the chord voicings, I can give the accompaniment a more active rhythm. Chopin used eighth notes, but the tempo for that prelude was quite a bit slower. Let's just look at the first 4 measures for a bit. If I were to turn these whole notes into eighth notes, at this tempo, I don't think it works, even at soft dynamics. Where the slow, unrelenting eighth notes from the Chopin created a somber feeling, these pulsating eighth notes have a livelier sound that, while nice, they don't really fit the emotion that I want. So I could try multiplying the eighth notes by 2. Something's not quite right about that either. I think it has to do with the rhythms of the melody being identical to the accompaniment in the second measure. There are all sorts of things you can do here. One option is something like this. Even though the rhythms now aren't constant eighths or quarter notes, they're still a regularly repeating pattern. After trying a few different textures, I settled on this. It features a more syncopated accompaniment in the bottom 2 voices and a more sustaining upper part of the accompaniment. Also, instead of immediately playing that C-sharp 7 chord in measure 2, I changed it to be a suspended 4/3 chord, and then the voice leading sort of descends stepwise. First to a diminished chord in beat 3, then finally the first inversion C-sharp 7 chord in the last 8th note of the measure. I also added the 7th scale degree in beat 3 of measure 4. I just liked how the voice leading sounded here. So I continued writing out this texture through the end, and followed for the most part the chord voicings and registers that I came up with earlier. I basically just added more syncopation, so here's what it sounds like. All right, so let's look at what we have at this point. We actually have 3 potential layers contributing to a texture. We have the melody in the top staff, and then the right hand of the accompaniment staff, which features longer sustaining notes, some lyrical moments as well, and syncopated rhythms towards the end. And finally, we have the bottom staff, which starts with syncopated repeating notes, then moves to pulsating quarter notes in the second half. So, how to orchestrate this? I know that this is only the second video in this Orchestrating Textures series, but one of the things I want to consistently do is to show brief excerpts from classical music and discuss how aspects of the orchestration might inspire and influence something we're doing now. So, for this orchestration assignment, I thought of a moment from Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, which he wrote for piano, and then many years later, Ravel orchestrated it for full orchestra. This movement is called the Old Castle, and I'm just showing the first 18 measures, which takes us to the end of the first statement of the theme. Because of copyright, I'm not going to play the audio, but I'll add a link to the video with the score and audio below. I just want to point out a few things about Ravel's orchestration here. First, look at how thin it is, 2 or 3 instruments at a time at most. So to me, it maintains the loneliness of the solo piano piece. Also, Ravel isn't doubling anything up or down by an octave. He's keeping the register as it was in the piano, at least in this opening passage. The melody is in a solo instrument, alto saxophone, so no doublings there. The strings are muted, so a slightly warmer timbre, and notice how Ravel moves the left-hand accompaniment between instrument groups. First in 2 bassoons before the melody enters, then to the low strings during the theme. When studying this piano score, you might not think to move around the left hand to different instruments, but then when hearing this orchestra version, it makes perfect sense as the muted strings blend so nicely with the saxophone. I strongly recommend going through the rest of this score if you haven't had a chance. So many good things here. Plus, it's a great way to study piano to orchestra skills. For my orchestration today, I'll be inspired by this in a few different ways. 1, keep things relatively small and intimate. I can still create a heaviness with a small number of instruments. 2, orchestrate the melody very simply and clearly, maybe just in a solo instrument. 3, use mostly woodwinds and muted strings, maybe throw in some horns, but overall I don't think I'll be using much brass today. And lastly, 4, I'll pay attention to the accompaniment and treat that with as much care as I would the melody. Okay, so I'll start with the first 8 measures. The piano score is at the top there. So I decided on using mostly woodwinds in the beginning with an English horn on the melody. I love the sound of English horn in this register. Even though the oboe would have worked just fine, I think English horn gives you a bit more of a sorrowful character in this register. Below the English horn, I have clarinets doubling that middle piano staff, and bassoons on the lower staff, trading off with 2 horns in between phrases. When the melody pauses or reaches the end of the phrase, that's an opportunity for a color change, so from bassoons to horns. It's subtle, but because there aren't many instruments present in total, that subtlety works well. To highlight that timbral change in measure 4, I bring in muted strings, very softly and mostly out of the way. They momentarily warm up the sound and help us move into the second half of the English horn melody. I also have them sort of leading into measure 9, and I composed a violin 1 part that sounds slightly melodic, but really it's just connecting phrases. Here's the entire first 8 measures. Onto the second half, here are the woodwinds, overall a slightly fuller texture, but still registerly compact. I have flutes and an oboe on the melody in unison. In this register, oboe cuts through better than the flute, hence 2 flutes and just 1 oboe, with an English horn doubling an octave lower. But I'm staying away from that upper treble register. Clarinets are sandwiched between the octave melody, just playing harmonizing notes, and bassoons, you can see, have that lower staff from the piano. Here's what this sounds like. In the horns and muted strings, I gave the syncopated part of the accompaniment to the top 2 horns, while the upper strings have a lot of the same notes, but sustaining. I'm doing the same basic thing in the lower 2 horns. I'm giving them the motion while low strings sustain, even though they share the same pitches. It's a way to create a more interesting background, almost like these strings are the sustain pedal from a piano. Let's hear this. All right, so I'll play the whole orchestration from beginning to end. Even with just 16 measures of music, I think there's a nice sense of flow and musical shape. That was inherent to the melody itself, so I'm just trying to bring that out in the orchestration. As always, I run out of room on the page for the MIDI view, but you can grab all of those files from my Patreon page if you're curious. So I wanted to do 2 more orchestrations of this piece, but I felt that the video would be too long, so I just made one additional orchestration. I decided to compose a slightly different arrangement this time, and it includes an introduction. Remember earlier in the video when I mentioned whether or not to make the regularity of the harmonic pacing be a prominent feature of the orchestration? In my first orchestration, I didn't shy away from having those downbeat chord changes be a foreground element. But what if you want to somehow mask that a bit? Of course, writing music that doesn't feature a strict harmonic rhythm would be the easiest, but I wondered how I might do it with this melody. So I decided that adding an introduction in F sharp minor, as well as a few measures in between melodic phrases, might help break up the strict rhythmic pattern. Both the intro and middle sections are based on a melodic idea that I came up with. I think I was trying to channel Mussorgsky here by combining a sense of complete sorrow and a sliver of hope. One other thing that the introduction does is that because it's in F sharp minor, that D major chord that occurs when the melody begins is now heard in a different overall context. That D major sonority represents the sliver of hope, and it's surrounded now on either side by the darker, more sorrowful F sharp minor chord. The other main thing that is different in this version is that I added a somewhat parallel shifting chord texture right here that I already know I'll have to be careful about when I orchestrate. My initial thought was to have this in woodwinds, while the melody at this point would shift to strings. But first, let's listen to this piano version. Okay, so let's take a look at the orchestration. Here are the first 8 measures. This is all introduction. I wanted to have the melodic gesture from this introduction passed between timbres. So I start with 2 flutes, then move to a solo clarinet, then back and forth. Underneath the melody, I similarly switch between two bassoons and two horns on the pulsating notes, and muted violas back and forth with muted celli, then eventually muted violins. So I've created these two measure units that line up with the introduction melodic phrase length. Let's hear how these 8 measures sound. Then we have the cadential part of the introduction. These first 3 measures here are a continuation from just before, with clarinets, bassoons, horns, and low strings finishing the phrase, which then moves on to a repeat from way back in the beginning, this time with solo bassoon on the melodic part, and just divisi celli on the accompaniment below. Everything's shifted down by an octave, so overall it sounds a bit darker. Here's how it sounds. Finally, we hear the main melody. This time, instead of English horn, I chose the oboe. I think it can cut through the texture a bit more in this range. There's a big arrival chord on the downbeat of the first measure shown here. It's sort of an exclamation point on this D major chord, where the total range is momentarily expanded upwards and downwards, before condensing back towards the middle. Even with the expanded instrumentation and register, I'm choosing instruments that, even with subito forte, can still hold back a bit, so divisi muted strings and woodwinds. I want this to sound strong in comparison to what came before, but not extremely loud. After the downbeat, the oboe plays the melody with horns and violas underneath. That intro melodic gesture then comes back while the oboe has a longer sustain over the F sharp minor chord. There's another emphasized downbeat at the start of the next phrase of the melody, not quite as strong, both in terms of register and dynamic marking. Let's hear what these measures sound like. So next we have a bit of music that I added between melodic phrases. This splits up the piece and creates a less rigid structure overall. I bring back a similar instrumentation to the beginning of the piece, with flutes alternating with clarinets, this time clarinets in octaves, just for some variety. Bassoons have the accompanying figures below, and strings enter as well, as the overall gesture is descending in the last 2 measures here. Second violins double English horn, and then violas double bass clarinet. Then we get the big arrival, and because I added a lot of extra music before, this now feels like a more deserving climactic moment. Remember I said earlier that I'd want to be cautious about the orchestration at this moment? That's because there's a lot of activity in the treble range that might compete for the foreground. I want both the melody and this parallel chordal texture to be heard, so I placed the melody in violins in octaves, sort of doubled at times by piccolo. Then the rest of the upper woodwinds have those parallel chords. Underneath, I have horns once again on the pulsating harmonic notes, with divisi violas playing arpeggios in a similar register. And then I have low winds and low strings, sustaining notes in the bass register. After the melody, I added a few extra measures of that introduction material, with the melody moving from English horn and violas to just a solo bassoon, as the overall texture thins out towards the last measure. So let's hear the full orchestration. I considered adding some additional light percussion instruments and maybe even harp, but ultimately I felt that it worked pretty well without them, so I just kept it as is. The MIDI files, music XML files, Dorico, Cubase, and Studio One files from this video are all on my Patreon page, so check it out if you're interested. Also, as you may have noticed, I've asked my patrons to supply me with these melodies and chords, so if you'd like to contribute to the series as well, I'd love to have your support on Patreon. Alright, so here it goes. So that's it for this one. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.